My name is Bob Barron. For those of you that don't know, I'm the chair of the board of the Greater Minor Jewish Federation. I want to welcome you all here today for this timely briefing on the Gaza war and Iran. And it's really an honor for us to be hosting our very esteemed visitors here from the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, also known as JINSA. I want to take a moment and welcome our Israeli Consul General Chaim Shacham, who we just gave him a farewell in our last board meeting, and now I found out that he's going to be with us for another year. So, I want to also a special shout out to our Executive Director, Federation Executive Director Emeritus, Michael Brody. Just a little background on JINSA. It was founded in 1976 as a nonpartisan organization to advocate on behalf of a strong U.S. security relationship with Israel and other like-minded allies. If we can find some like-minded allies. In December 2014, they commissioned a high-level task force of retired U.S. generals to visit Israel and conduct an independent assessment of Israel military's conduct during its 2014 campaign in Gaza. The delegation's report was unveiled in early March, and just last month, task force members spoke directly to the UN and others throughout Europe. We are delighted to have them along with JINSA CEO Michael Makovsky, who is here with us today and will speak with us shortly. After we hear from the task force members, Michael will be providing a most timely analysis of the recently announced deal in Iran's nuclear program. So without further delay, I want to introduce the chair of our Jewish Community Relations Council, Shelley Nicely-Groff, to welcome our speakers. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a packed room in the middle of July in Miami, and I know that's just because of the incredible speakers that we have with us today. So welcome, everybody. I do want to let you all know that camera back there in the room is because we are recording today's session. This being Miami in July, there are a lot of folks who would have liked to have been here today to hear from our speakers, but they are out of town, and so we are recording the session so that they will be able to hear what we are hearing and learning today. And just to add to Bob's welcomes, it's wonderful to have so many Federation board members here today. Thank you all for coming. And I also want to extend a welcome to APAC Regional Director Mark Kleinman. I'm not sure if he's here yet, but if he's not, he's on his way, and we look forward to welcoming him. As many of you know, the work of the JCRC is built on the premise that one of our key roles is to educate and engage our community to facilitate ongoing dialogue and advocacy. And this is done in a balanced and a nonpartisan and a respectful discourse. The most effective way for us to encourage such lively dialogue and meaningful advocacy is to provide facts on the issues and interpretation of these issues by experts. And so we are very fortunate to have a strong relationship with JINSA that allows us to avail ourselves of their remarkable expertise on both Israel and Iran. And so without further ado from me, I am going to introduce our first two speakers who are going to speak on Gaza. Lieutenant General Richard Natansky. He is the former commander of the United States Marine Corps Forces Command and a member of JINSA's Gaza Assessment Task Force. He participated in the non-combatant evacuation operations in Cambodia and South Vietnam. He also served as an observer to the United Nations Truth Supervision Organization in the Middle East. He participated in a humanitarian relief mission for Haitian migrants in Cuba and operations in Somalia. He then became the Deputy Director for Operations in the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. General Natansky deployed in 2002 to Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom, and he assumed command of the U.S. Marine Corps Forces Command in 2008. And I just have to say this, and if I could raise my voice even more, I would, because this is extraordinary. He served in the Marine Corps for 37 years. and he retired as the most decorated Marine on active duty. I also want to introduce, before they speak, Professor Jeffrey Korn, who's sitting right directly to my left. Professor Korn is a senior legal advisor to JINSA's Gaza Assessment Task Force and a senior advisor to JINSA's, and I'm going to try to pronounce this right, Gimonder Center for Defense and Strategy. He has served as the Army's senior law of war expert in the Office of the Judge Advocate General, as well as the chief of the law of war branch in the International Law Division. Prior to serving as the law of war expert, Professor Korn spent 21 years on active duty and retired in the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He is currently a presidential research professor of law at South Texas College of Law in Houston, where he also serves as the faculty advisor to the National Security Law Society. On behalf of the students, thank you. He has become an expert witness at the Military Commission in Guantanamo, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and in federal court. He is also the author of numerous books. General Jones, who we had anticipated to be with us today, was needed in D.C. today, and we thank him for his intent to come, but unfortunately we will not be able to hear from him. So with that, I will turn it over to our first two speakers.
Well, Bob and Shelley, thank you for having us here this morning. Just to give you a little background on what we did, this was an initiative by Mike to take a group of retired general officers. There were 2 Army, 2 Air Force, and a Marine, me, and bring us to Israel with the express purpose of doing an analysis or an assessment of the Gaza Strip conflict last July and August. And the intent was to observe, take back observations, implications, and bring back recommendations to the U.S. Armed Forces. Because the threats, as we discussed last night, that they premiere in Israel, and they come to a theater later on that we may be involved in. So there are a lot of very, very important lessons that we took back from this assessment. And this assessment has been briefed to congressmen, to the Department of Defense, and to a lot of other official agencies. And it's taken a lot of traction. Just as an aside, you heard I was a UN observer. I lived in Israel, in Tiberias and Nahariya, working the Golan Heights in southern Lebanon back in the late 80s. I also had the opportunity to do some patrols in the Gaza Strip, and I used to take my family to the recreation beach in Gaza. It's not there anymore. But it was a wonderful tour, and had we stayed probably 3 months longer, my youngest daughter would have had to go back and serve in the IDF, because she was conceived in the Holy Land, but born in the United States. So let me get back right now to the assessment, and I'm going to cover a couple of the observations we had, and then Jeff will cover a couple more, and then we'll open it up to questions, and then Mike, I think, is going to talk about this agreement with Iran, which I think is all in their minds as well. First thing, and it's nothing new, but Israel faced what we call a hybrid enemy with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It's just like Hezbollah. It's like ISIS. It's an enemy that is not a nation state, but it has the weapons that we associate with most nations. Very sophisticated, high-tech weapons. And we saw that with the rockets. They have air defense. And what they tried to do as a hybrid enemy is to use this technology, their military actions, and their ability to influence politically other nations for their own desired, what we would call end state. So hence, they didn't feel that a victory on the battlefield was necessary as long as it could influence opinion against Israel. And you see it with ISIS, trying to influence, not necessarily geared towards a world audience, but recruits coming in to fight for ISIS. So this is a big takeaway, because as our own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said recently, after our report was issued, but this is a threat that the United States is going to face in the future. Enemies that aren't necessarily tied to uniformed militaries and to a nation, but have the equipment and the technologies that can make a very deadly enemy. That's a quick overview of our first observation. I'm going to talk about some of the technologies that we observed that kind of came out as a result of this conflict. The first, unmanned aerial vehicles. We call them drones. We call them remotely piloted vehicles. If you watched the news, you saw one land on the White House grounds a few months ago, and more recently, although it was manned, a gyrocopter flown by a Florida resident that landed on the Capitol grounds. We hear about Amazon and the fact that they want to be able to deliver packages with a drone. Well, imagine delivering a package that's full of explosives into the Super Bowl during the game. During the Gaza conflict, Hamas launched an unmanned aerial vehicle towards Israel, and Israel knocked it down. They knocked it down with a Patriot missile. Now, from an economical perspective, the trade-off, not very good. A couple $100 for an unmanned aerial vehicle, a couple thousand, a lot more for a Patriot missile. It's not as easy to knock down, and today we really don't have the technology to detect or destroy unmanned aerial vehicles. You just can't shoot them down. Imagine shooting down a drone flying across the Washington Mall. You know, if you shoot bullets, they got to land somewhere. So that's a real challenge. And I'm not to say that we aren't working on it right now, but I still work for the Marine Corps as a mentor. And back in February, we were doing an exercise, and we had a notional enemy. And the notional enemy happened to have unmanned aerial vehicles. And they used them against us. And you know what? We don't have the capability to knock them down. A lucky shot, maybe, but it is a challenge that we face, not just in the United States and Israel, but just in our own government and in our country in terms of not as a military target or item, but as a terrorist weapon. So one technology that we need, and that's to defeat unmanned aerial vehicles. Another one, if you've ever seen a Marine emblem, it's an eagle, globe, and anchor. We fight in what we call all three domains: the land, the sea, the air. Well, now we've got new domains. I think you've heard a lot in the news recently about cyber, the internet, the domain of the cyber community. We also saw a domain in the Gaza Strip, which we coined, and I don't think it was original to us, but the subterranean domain, the tunnels. The IDF uncovered at least 32 tunnels leading from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Now, they used these tunnels, one, to launch offensive attacks into Israel, either to kidnap Israeli soldiers or to attack Israeli civilians. They used them to keep supplies, to communicate with messengers underground, and they also used them to bury their rocket and mortar launchers. And they used the law of armed conflict, which Jeff will talk about, but they happened to place a lot of the rockets and mortars next to what we call protected structures, i.e. hospitals, schools, and mosques. So why is the subterranean domain such a challenge? Well, when you're underground, you can't use our unmanned aerial vehicles to look down and detect what the enemy is doing, because they're underground. You can't use the capability to what we call signals intelligence, but intercept the radio communications, be it cell phone or otherwise, of the enemy, because it's all being done underground. So as we see, even in San Diego, with the tunnels coming from Mexico, bringing illegal drugs into this country, we don't have the capability to detect nor destroyed tunnels. And when I talk about tunnels, I think you've seen in the news recently, El Chapo's tunnel in Mexico. That's almost as sophisticated as the tunnels coming out of Gaza. Concrete reinforcement, wide, big enough to ride motorcycles down, miles long, 100 feet down below the ground. And it's not like you say, well, it's easy to knock down the tunnel. First, you got to be able to find it, and then two, when it's 90 feet underground, it's not easy to destroy. So that's a technology we need. Another technology, Iran trained commando swimmers that belong to Hamas, kind of like what we call SEALs. And they provided them with a technology that our SEALs have. Being in Florida here, I think you're all very familiar with scuba. The one thing about scuba is when you're underwater, you give off bubbles. And you can be detected when you're swimming in the water with the bubbles. The Hamas commandos used what we call a rebreathing system that does not emit bubbles. And they were actually launched from inside the Gaza Strip, swam north, and came out in Israel. Fortunately, Israel had cameras that detected their exit from the beach, and they were immediately intercepted and killed by Israeli defense forces. But once again, what happens if you have swimmers going into Haifa and putting explosives on ships, or trying another insertion closer to a civilian kibbutz or population center? So another technology, and the last technology I'll cover briefly, is the ability. We saw the Iron Dome and how effective it was against rockets. But the Hamas also shot mortars. And a mortar is just a tube that you drop an explosive shell down, it goes up, and it comes down, and it's about a 15-second warning that you might be able to get to any people in the targeted area. It doesn't give you a lot of time to seek shelter. So what you have to do is, although we have the technology to detect the launch, we don't have the technology to hit the mortar round as it hits its apex and starts coming down, because it's only a matter of seconds before it impacts. Once again, I think we are looking at this technology, but a means, whether it's a mortar or even an artillery round, to knock it out of the sky before it impacts. You know, I've heard there were 6 Israeli civilians killed during the Gaza conflict, and it was this indiscriminate firing by Hamas that killed them. And everything we can do to provide the technologies to protect those civilians, I think, is very, very critical. So I've given you a quick overview of some of the findings we had, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to pick up on the law and how Hamas exploited the law in their campaign. So Jeff, you got it.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to all of you for your time and attention. I know our time is tight, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about my role in the assessment process. That's all laid out in the introduction to the report, and I'd encourage you to read it. I would like to focus on supporting what you indicated is the objective, which is to provide unbiased and objective information that will enable you to contribute to a legitimate dialogue on some of these very important issues in the broader community. When I became involved in the report, I didn't go on the assessment. I've been to Israel many times. I've studied with Israeli military lawyers. I've been in the tunnels. I'm familiar with their conduct of operations. But I provided a role that I provided when I was in the Army. These officers were going to do an assessment of an operation, and I was going to give them the legal background. But as the report evolved, it became apparent that law was really one of the central themes of the conflict. And I wasn't surprised by that, because military operations cannot be conducted outside of a legal framework. And today, more than ever, that law is viewed as the touchstone of legitimacy for democracies conducting military operations. The problem is that it's widely misunderstood, distorted, and manipulated to achieve objectives for opponents who seek to undermine the legitimacy of democracies when they are compelled to use military force, and to compromise the effectiveness of their capacity by using law as a weapon against them. So law as an integral part of military operations is an aspect of that report. For the IDF, like for the United States military, that's because the law provides the moral foundation for the conduct of hostilities and war. And one of the important points that anybody discussing conflict needs to understand is that war is not supposed to be a fair game. War is the imposition of your will on your opponent through the force of arms. It's a brutal endeavor. General Natonski knows it much better than I do from personal experience. But anybody who's served in uniform understands that war is about applying deadly combat power as effectively as you can to bring your enemy to submission. There's a legal component to it. Commanders are under an obligation to constantly strive to mitigate the suffering of the innocent in that conflict situation, the civilians and civilian property. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Palestinian civilian or an Israeli civilian. The protection applies to both. It's a humanitarian obligation. It's as old as organized warfare itself. It traces back to great religious documents like the Old Testament, the Book of Manu, the Bushido Code. Whatever you look at, you will find limitations on war. So for the IDF, they understand the role of law properly, that it provides the moral framework for the conduct of hostilities for the young men and women that they have to put into combat. For the enemy, law is also an integral part of the operations, but not for a legitimate purpose. For the enemy, law becomes a weapon. It becomes a weapon you can use against your more powerful opponent in an effort to neuter their capability. Why? Because you know they are going to try and comply with the law. And so what you do is you endanger your own civilian population to make their use of force that much more complex and complicated in an effort to make them hesitate. And this was rampant in the Gaza conflict. And so one of the points I would suggest you take away from the report in this discussion, whenever you engage in a debate on the legality of military operations, focus on 2 points. First off, you cannot judge legality based on effects, which is what the international community likes to do. They like to add up numbers. 2,000 Palestinian civilians killed, 6 Israeli civilians killed. Obviously, the IDF must be the wrongdoer in this conflict. It's completely invalid, because when a commander conducts military operations, what is demanded of him or her is credible judgment. And the judgment is based on what you anticipate. So one of the great flaws of this UN report is they emphasize this imbalance in casualties. Well, that's because the IDF was better at protecting civilians, and the Hamas was interested in endangering civilians. So what we have to focus on is not the cause of civilian casualties. We have to focus on the responsibility for civilian casualties under the law. And on that standard, it's very clear that the Israelis, like U.S. forces, were facing an enemy that was deliberately trying to increase the risk of civilian casualties, while the IDF was doing everything they could do to mitigate the risk of civilian casualties. If we apply the law properly, then what we recognize is that the IDF efforts deserve to be praised and the enemy efforts have to be condemned. Another point I would suggest that you take away from this is the recognition that commanders have to be judged by what they could decide based on the information they had available at the time of a decision, not on the outcome. So a commander could conduct an attack where no civilian was harmed that is completely illegal, like Hamas indiscriminately firing rockets towards Israel. The condemnation comes from the decision to do it, not from the fact that it didn't produce the effect that was desired. And a commander can conduct a completely lawful attack that produces civilian casualties that were unavoidable. That's the nature of war. So war, the laws of war or the law of armed conflict does not prohibit civilian casualties. What it prohibits is conducting an attack where you anticipate that the civilian casualties will be excessive in relation to the military advantage that you will gain from that attack. So if the enemy puts its rocket firing position in the schoolyard of a kindergarten, and there's no alternative other than to attack that, then the question doesn't become, why did you cause civilian casualties? The appropriate question is, did you use a tactic that mitigated the risk of civilian casualties? And when the generals looked at the Israeli processes, what they concluded was that they followed the same processes that they would have used in combat, which I would say is the gold standard of compliance with the law. So invalidity of effects-based condemnation. Now, by the way, the news loves this effects-based approach because it's easy. It's a lot easier to show the emotive images of damaged buildings and dead civilians than it is to recreate the target selection and decision-making process that the commander was confronted with. Another piece of this that I think we need to do a much better job of in this country is I think we have in many ways dehumanized the warrior. Right now in Israel it's a very different perception. Why? Because all the young men and women in that country serve. So the reality is that the Israeli public understands that the soldiers that they put into combat are human beings from a moral society that cares about life, that doesn't want to cause indiscriminate harm. On the several interviews I did during the war with CNN, with PBS, I would always ask the moderator, why would you assume that an Israeli commander would be indifferent towards causing the death of innocent civilians? I think it's the exact opposite. I think the people that are involved in the business of war, if they come from a moral society and they're part of an institution that values respect for the law, are the most sensitive to the consequences of deadly combat operations. And they're the ones who have to live with these awesome responsibilities. It's something I think we tend to forget in the discourse. We see the American soldier or the Israeli soldier as kind of this robot who has no concern for the consequence of military operations. We need to push back against that. We need to remind people that these soldiers don't stop being moral human beings when they put on a uniform. I certainly didn't. My brother hasn't done that. My son, who's about to start his career in the Air Force, won't do that. General Natansky didn't do that. And I guarantee you, without even asking him, the last thing he wanted in his units were Marines who had no sense of moral clarity. He wanted the exact opposite. He wanted Marines who understood that there was a line between morality and immorality, even in the midst of deadly combat. So we have to remind people that when we see a commander in Israel or the United States authorize an attack on a building, there's probably a pretty compelling reason why he was put into that situation to do that. Third point about the report, what I call no good deed goes unpunished, right? So this goes back to this instinct of effects-based condemnation. The law of armed conflict or the law of war, whatever you want to call it, tells commanders, do everything you can to mitigate risk to the civilian population. One of those things is to give warnings to the civilian population so that they avoid the consequence of combat operations. The IDF did that to an extent in Gaza that I don't think has ever been seen before. And they tried to be creative in the process. They used methods that had never been used before. Now, to be fair, they had the opportunity to do that because the situation was very different for them than it is for most armies or Marine units going into combat because they were so intimately familiar with the area in which they were fighting, to the point where they had banks of telephone numbers they could send text messages to. That's not a common situation. So we shouldn't expect that every military commander will do everything the IDF did exactly the same in every operation. What we should do is reward the fact that they were going to such extensive effort to comply with that obligation. But what's happened in the discourse is that instead of focusing on their efforts to warn the civilian population as a manifestation of good faith commitment to moral warfare and legal warfare, we look at the effects. And the number one example of this is what they called the knock on the roof tactic, where they would fire a low-yield round on the top of a building, not to destroy it, but to warn the residents of the building to go to ground, because a more significant attack was about to occur. The UN report that came out condemned the Israeli commanders for doing this because they said that the civilians in the building might have been confused. They wouldn't know whether the first explosion was the warning or the attack. And in truth, that's a legitimate consideration in the future. So in the future, a commander considering this tactic should consider how will the civilians react to it. But to condemn the innovation because they didn't completely predict the consequence of what they were trying to do, when it was so clearly designed to comply with their obligation, is pernicious. And what it will do is it will undermine the efforts of commanders in the future who are trying to be innovative and creative in their tactics in an effort to mitigate civilian risk and enhance humanitarian protection in war, which will be a negative consequence. In other words, you don't condemn a commander because everything he tried didn't work perfectly. You reward a commander because he was trying so hard to get it right and mitigate risk. Finally, the key element of the report falls under this umbrella of a term that's thrown around sometimes called lawfare. You recall at the beginning of the presentation, I told you that law was an integral part of the operations of both the legitimate military forces and the hybrid enemy. But for the hybrid enemy, law doesn't perform a moral function, it performs an immoral function. Because what they do is they manipulate the law to achieve military advantage over their enemy. They view the law as a capacity multiplier at the tactical and strategic level. At the tactical level, they use the compliance with the law of their enemy to neuter the combat effectiveness of those operations, as we discussed, maximizing the risk to the civilian population in order to make the IDF or the American forces more hesitant. At the strategic level, it becomes the benchmark of messaging. So what Hamas did brilliantly is they used images of the destruction of war to paint a picture that the Israelis were the illegal and immoral party to this conflict. And the only way that can happen is if the general public is ignorant of the law and ignorant of what commanders are really expected to do in warfare. And so the better we educate people on what war really is and what the law really permits, the more effectively we can attack that manipulation of the law to achieve a strategic discrediting of legitimate military forces endeavoring desperately to comply with the law against an enemy who has no respect whatsoever for the humanitarian obligations that international law imposes upon them.
We have some time for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. So,
To what extent does the Islamic tradition accept the Western tradition of the combat rules that you've been describing?
You know, I think it's interesting. I have taught professional officers from Islamic countries, and they have no hesitation in embracing this basic equation. If you were to talk to a Jordanian fighter pilot, I'm sure the fighter pilot would say, if I'm running in on an attack and I see hundreds of children at the target area, I'm probably going to pull up and go back and get more guidance, because it's consistent with the true interpretation of the faith that I believe in. And in fact, there are principles in the Quran itself related to humane warfare. This is a complete distortion of not only the law, but I think the faith itself, in order to gain an advantage over a tactically and militarily more proficient enemy.
Stanley.
First, I appreciate hearing from both of you. I have heard during the Gaza war, when Israel was fighting, there were lawyers either with the commanders or on the phone available to the commanders because they were fighting a legal war. And I am concerned when we have two different playing fields of how we're fighting, and that the world is looking at it in the pictures in a different way. And what you say to educate people, that's nice, but that's not going to happen. So what can we do to change the playing field that is better? Because the United States is going to face the same thing with ISIS and what they're doing.
Well, let me start by suggesting what I think we can't do. We can't descend to that level of brutality, right? As and Mike knows this because I say this all the time, this is personal for me. My son's about to be one of those drone pilots. I want him to know that he's operating with moral clarity, just like the parents of Israeli soldiers want them to know if they have to go into combat, they can come out of it with a sense of moral completeness, right? This is the reality of modern warfare. So we have to learn to deal with it better. And I think you're right. I think the generals would say the Israelis could have done better with their messaging and their information campaign, but there are certain things you cannot change. But I think there's another subtle element to this. There have to be voices that push back against this illegitimacy argument, because I think it's actually detrimental to the morale of the forces themselves. When they go into battle and all they hear constantly in the media is how evil they are and how immoral they are, it starts to make them question their own legitimacy. So I think the law has to remain an integral part of operations. By the way, the general and I were having this discussion on the ride over here. I know the military lawyers you're talking about in the IDF, right? Trust me, they did not substitute their judgments for the judgments of those tactical and operational commanders. They helped those commanders navigate a morally and legally complex battle space. But the authority to decide when and where to use force is a commander's obligation, not a lawyer's obligation. So I think there's been some overstatement of that. And in fact, there's more involvement of lawyers in U.S. military operations than even IDF operations. But ultimately, we have to just get used to what Justice Barak said in the interrogation opinion from the Israeli High Court of Justice. It's true that in many cases democracies fight with one hand tied behind their back, but when they do, they're ultimately stronger because they're manifesting the values they're fighting for. And I think if we start to erode that, then it leads to a dangerous slippery slope.
Steve.
We hear all the time how technology has outstripped the law or out ahead of the law in so many, just here in the U.S. and just in our daily lives. And I'm sure it's true in the military too. And I'm wondering to what extent, what effort is being made to kind of catch up and deal with some of the issues that the technology is presenting?
Well, technology, as we saw in Iraq, every time the enemy introduces a weapon, the IED, a very simplistic weapon. When we invaded Iraq and I was part of the invasion, there were no IEDs. I came back a year later and the counterinsurgency was in full effect and you had IEDs. So what did we do to try to keep up with the technology of the IED? We introduced armored vehicles. We started with armoring up the Humvees, and they got more armor, and what did the enemy do? They put bigger explosives. Then they would use garage openers or cell phones to initiate the IEDs. And you constantly see adversaries trying to get a leg up on their opponent with technology, and it's a vicious cycle. All of those MRAPs that we bought that saved lives in Iraq are sitting over in the Middle East because they're no good anywhere else in the world. They're too big for the Marine Corps to put on a ship. And if we take them to the Pacific, where you're talking about a rainforest, where that armor might have protected you from an IED in Iraq, it's going to bog you down in a jungle, and you're going to be a sitting duck. So I'm not sure whether you're talking about the cycle of technology, but something as simple as a drone or an unmanned. I saw on the news 2 days ago, some kid in Connecticut put a pistol on his drone and was demonstrating firing it remotely from his control unit. And some kid did that. We've got hackers that are disrupting our cyber, our internets. I was one of the victims of this big OPM data steal that took place in Washington. So all my data is over there in China, along with 20 million other people. And so is my kids and everyone that was part of my background investigation. So you have to stay ahead of the technologies. And that's why I think a lot of agencies in the United States are working on some of the technologies I talked about. But as soon as you get a breakthrough, the enemy's already thinking about how can I get a leg up on that, how do I defeat that technology?
But the other part of your question is the law effective to deal with these evolutions? And I think the answer is yes, if it's properly understood. I was at a conference in Israel that Sharad Hadin did about the evolution of the law of war, and the woman who was the head of the International Law Division for the IDF during the last Gaza conflict, the one that led to the Goldstone Report, she sat up there and she said, I get this question all the time. People say the law is not good enough, we can't do what we need to do. She says, tell me what you want to do and I'll tell you if you can do it. Well, the enemy's put his rocket in a house. Okay, we can attack him. Well, the enemy's using human shields. Okay, we can deal with it. And her point was the generalization that the law is an impediment to effective military operations is overblown if the law is properly understood and interpreted, because it was always designed to be flexible enough to enable a military commander to effectively accomplish the military mission in a way that mitigates civilian risk as much as feasible. And the enemy will always continue to evolve tactics to challenge that. The law is flexible enough for us to respond to that.
We have time for a final brief question. Fred's had his hands up, and I have a final brief question, and then we're going to introduce Dr. Makovsky. So, Fred.
My question is that we're about a year out from the war last summer, and I'm not sure whether you can comment on it, but where are we in relation to where we were a year ago in terms of Hamas's capabilities to mount another attack? Where are we with the tunnels? There's a lot in this document that talks about Israel's challenge in relation to dismantling these tunnels. Has there been any work in the area of technology to look at that? And, I guess, we're a year out. Where are we? Do we know? And has Israel been able to counter any of the measures that were talked about in the report?
I think in terms of technologies, a lot of that is in the high classification. I get wind because I've brought this up to military audiences, and someone said, well, in my last job we were working that specifically, but I can't tell you anything else. I think it's important to note the tunnels were very, very effective. Big thing happened, not in Israel, but in Egypt a little while ago when the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi were overthrown. And you had General Sisi come into power in Egypt. One of the first things he did was shut down the tunnels that went from the Sinai into the Gaza Strip. Hamas used those tunnels. One, they taxed the goods coming through. I mean, it was regular goods as well as the components for those rockets. Those rockets didn't come through the tunnels. They were built in the Gaza Strip. All the concrete that came in to build those tunnels came, the tunnels going into Israel came through the tunnels in the Sinai. So that, and Israel, or Egypt is being attacked. If you heard this week, a large group of Egyptian soldiers were killed by ISIS in the Sinai. And there's no love lost between Hamas and Egypt. So from that perspective, I think they're going to starve Hamas down to the point where they're going to lose some of their capability inside the Gaza Strip. The problem is they're a terrorist group. One of the things, we had open kimono in Israel. They opened their doors and told us everything we asked, more so than I think we would have been up front in the Pentagon. But when Hamas took over, after Israel left the Gaza Strip, and Hamas took over after their split with the Palestinian authorities, you know, they took some of the Palestinian authorities still left in the Gaza Strip up to, I think it was a 13-story apartment building, and threw them off. And they are ruling by terror. I don't think the general Palestinian or the general Afghan or general Iraqi people, all they want is peace and security for their families. And yet you have groups like ISIS in Syria, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in parts of Lebanon, ruling with terror. One of our success stories in the Al-Anbar province was the fact we were able to turn the Sunni into friends. It was called the Awakening, and once they could point out who the enemy was, because an American can't tell an Al-Qaeda from a regular Iraqi citizen, the dynamics changed. Of course, the cities that we fought so hard and we lost Americans in places like Ramadi and Fallujah are now in the hands of ISIS, which was a tactical error, I think, on the United States for abandoning our forces in Iraq when we pulled out in 2011. But I think there is some progress, and I have no doubt, and I don't think the Israeli Defense Forces do either, that Hamas is going to do something else, because that's by their very nature, to maybe draw attention away from the plight of what's going on. And once again, one of our findings we really haven't touched on, but is how well Hamas used the global media to get people on their side. And you know what? We thought that the IDF, which was responsible for the domestic message, did a pretty good job, but it was not a whole of government effort in Israel. And we talked to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem, and they were not in bed with the IDF. They were not getting the message out to the global audience, which was a responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What they needed was some of the technology. The IDF wouldn't release some of their classified video, which could substantiate some of the claims that were being made in the global press. And that was one of our findings. It goes for the United States too. The State Department and the U.S. military need to work closer together, and you gotta work the social media, because if you look at generations, we got our news at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and maybe reading the newspaper. Your grandchildren probably get it off the Twitter or Twitter, but they get it off the social media, and it's different for the different generations, and that's what you have to get to tie together, and that was one of our findings, that this is going to happen. It's going to happen to us again, and I'm stealing too much of Mike's thunder because I know he wants to talk about Iran.
Did you want to make a brief response?
Very briefly,
Okay.
in response how things change, I think the access that the generals have is a manifestation of a very important change. The IDF and the legal branch, the military advocate general in particular, have recognized that they have to be more transparent with the processes that they use. They wrote a remarkably in-depth report about the conflict. And of course, you're not going to influence people who've already made up their mind, but there are people in the margin who you will influence. And I think in the future, the release of those type of classified videos will be much more common and much more rapid to arm people like me with the objective information I need to be able to go on CNN or PBS and say, here's the evidence that shows you have a commander complying with the law and an enemy violating the law.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for your candor and your frankness. And I just want to point out that there are copies of this document around the table. I, for one, am going to read it when I get home. There's clearly a lot of very important information in here for all of us, and I encourage everyone, please bring them home with you and read it. Want to give a brief introduction to Dr. Makovsky before I turn the floor over to him. Michael Makovsky joined JINSA in 2013 as CEO. He is a United States national security expert, has worked extensively on Iran's nuclear program, the Middle East, and the intersection of international energy markets and politics with U.S. national security. From 2006 to 2013, Mike was the Foreign Policy Director for the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he managed projects on topics including a new U.S. policy toward Iran's nuclear development and a new strategy toward Russia. Mike served as Special Assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, was Director of Essential Services in the Washington office of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which is the post-war allied entity that governed Iraq, and advised senior defense, national security council, and energy officials on Iraqi and Middle Eastern energy policy. He has written articles, op-eds, and editorials on U.S. national security issues, primarily involving the Middle East. They have been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Weekly Standard, and the New Republic. He has been interviewed on CNBC, CNN, Fox, NPR, Voice of America, Persian, and other media. He is also the author of Churchill's Promised Land, which is a diplomatic intellectual history of Winston Churchill's complex relationship with Zionism. Mike has a PhD in diplomatic history from Harvard University, an MBA in finance from the Columbia Business School, and a Bachelor of Arts in history from the University of Chicago. Clearly an expert, Mike. Thank you. And please share your thoughts and comments.
Thank you very much, Shelley and Bob and Carol for hosting and organizing this. And nice to see Chaim from the Israeli Council. A few things. I'll just add one thing on Gaza, and then I'll turn right to Iran. I just want to say one thing about these guys. First of all the 5 generals were commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan, so they have a lot of real experience in urban conflict. One of the findings that I found interesting, when you read it, you'll see it, it's in the executive summary as well, is that I found that they noticed is that they were concerned that if the U.S. adopts the Israeli standard, it would be counterproductive for us achieving our missions. So they were concerned that the Israeli standard was frankly too high, and they don't want it to be the new standard, at least for American military action, which I found particularly an interesting angle on this. Let me turn to the Iran issue. Obviously, this is the issue of the day. It's not just the issue of the day or the issue of the week or the issue of the month, I think, nor the year, not to be over dramatic about it, but I really believe it's the issue not just of our time, really, of my lifetime, and I think many of our lifetimes. Many of you, maybe you were alive during World War II, maybe you would have a different view. But at least for me, I can't imagine a bigger issue than this one right today. You always hear people speak, maybe in synagogue or elsewhere, saying this is the most important issue you've got to deal with. And it really gets diluted. It all gets watered down. Well, if that was so important, why next year did I hear a sermon about that? And the thing is, but this is it, I think. I can't think of a more important issue that has so much a dramatic impact on the United States, on our national security, and also Israel. Now let me go over, I'll give a few details, I'll give my view about overall, and I'd love to have any questions. First of all, let me just step back for one brief second. Shelley mentioned that I directed a foreign policy program at a place called the Bipartisan Policy Center, which began when I came on board in 2006. We started a task force, which was bipartisan, because everything we do is bipartisan, on Iran, because we thought that during the Bush administration there was no clear policy on what to do with Iran. When Bush was president, he really strengthened Iran inadvertently, even though it was part of the axis of evil. He got rid of Saddam, he got rid of the Taliban, and he didn't deal with their nuclear program. Now, you could argue the pros and cons of all those policies, but those are the facts, I think, that the Iranian regime strengthened during the Bush administration. Now, when Obama came into office, the program was still not that advanced in many ways. There weren't that many centrifuges. And the Bush administration did succeed in one very clear way. Because of them, there were about 5 UN Security Council resolutions that were passed calling for suspension. Obama came in with a clear policy of reaching out his hand to the Iranians. I always thought it was a good idea. You got to do diplomacy, but it has to be part of a three-legged stool: diplomacy, sanctions, and a credible military option. That essentially was the policy of the Obama administration, I think, in the first term. But again, he was dealt a bad hand. He tried to lay out a broad approach. He talked about all options on the table. He reached out diplomatically. He talked about all options being on the table and the military option. And although it wasn't really his initiative, it came more from Congress, certainly, but there were tough sanctions that only started really getting imposed in 2010. And then a couple of years later with the banking sanctions, and then the EU came in with oil sanctions around the same time. So tough sanctions on Iran have only been in place for a few years. After President Obama was reelected, then he took a different tack and he began this secret approach to the Iranians that have now culminated into what with this deal today. He didn't talk to the Saudis, he didn't talk to the Israelis. It was a secret U.S. approach that took a very different approach. It culminated in an interim deal, the Joint Plan of Action, which was actually agreed to in November 2013, which laid the groundwork for the deal that was just signed last week. So that is, I think, and that this past approach has been a departure, a very radical departure, I think, from the approach that the administration had followed in its first term. It was not focused on sanctions. There was really almost no discussion of the military option, although just broadly, but no one really took it that seriously after the non-implementation of the Syrian Red Line of 2013. And it was really just focused on diplomacy and a very different approach in the end game than what had been discussed before. Now, this deal, as you know, has united the Arabs and the Israelis together in a way that we've never seen before since 1948. And it might not last too much. It might last for a little bit, but it has united the whole spectrum in Israel, the Labor Party, Bougie Herzog, and Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud, who was the prime minister, and a number of the Arab regimes, particularly the Saudis, and the UAE and the Jordanians, and so on. Now, let me just say a few points about what the deal does, what it doesn't do. Essentially, the deal, as I see it, and there's still there's still plenty of questions that need to be answered. There's still, even in 159-page text, there's still a lot of lack of clarity. Basically, in the near term, there are curbs on the Iranian nuclear program. They have to reduce by almost 97% the amount of enriched uranium that they have. Where that exactly goes, I'm still not sure. Whether it gets shipped out, which I don't think it will, because the Iranians have already said they won't do that. It'll probably be under some sort of lock and key in Iran. There will be less centrifuges operating, roughly from 9,000 to about 5,000. There'll be some limits on R&D on their program. Their plutonium track, there are two ways of getting a bomb: uranium, plutonium. Their plutonium plant is supposed to be refigured. And they'll have supposedly greater inspections, something that's called additional protocols, which really doesn't really mean too much. It has to be negotiated among the parties, but there might be tougher sanctions, inspections. But now let's say, but there's still some things. One of the important things has not been resolved: potential military dimensions of their facilities. Now let's talk about what it doesn't do, or what it does do, in return for these curbs. And essentially, there are these curbs, and over a certain amount of time, these curbs are going to go away. 5 years and in 8 years, there'll also be the embargo on selling conventional weapons to them will go away, and on their ballistic missiles. But essentially, by 15 years, I don't think it's disputed really. Really, most of the restrictions that are important are going to go away. And as President Obama said in an NPR interview in April, the breakout time from year 12, 13 to 15 will essentially go to zero. Now, the administration is said that this black salt pathways to a bomb. I'm not sure how they could credibly say that at all. Because Obama himself said the breakout time from when they could dash to a bomb will go to virtually zero. Now the administration has taken that back, but the president was actually right when he said that, because that's exactly what's going to happen. So essentially, there'll be these near-term curbs, but after year 15, if not earlier, and this is if Iran does not cheat, and that's obviously a big if, given that they're congenital cheaters. This interim deal that they've had signed in November 2000, it was signed in January 2014, but it was agreed to in November 2013. They've cheated on that, and I thought it was a pretty good deal that they had already, and they've been cheating on that deal, and I'm happy to discuss what that is. But even if they don't cheat, and some people might think they won't cheat because the deal is so good for them, I think they'll still cheat a bit because I think it's in their DNA. But even if they don't cheat, by year 15, they'll have an internationally blessed nuclear program. They'll be very robust. They will have a lot of R&D done. They'll be working with some advanced centrifuges, which are far more advanced than the ones they have today. And they will have, again, international blessing for this. They'll be essentially treated like Japan without having the policies or the political system of Japan. And of course, this won't deal anything with their behavior. They can still remain the chief sponsor of terror as they are today. They can still persecute homosexuals in their city, in their country. Remember Ahmadinejad, the president before, said there are no homosexuals in Iran. They could still lead the world in per capita executions as they do today. They actually kill more. They execute more people than the Chinese. It's a competitive field, but they've excelled in that actually. So they could do all those things, and they could still have international blessing with a nuclear weapon. And it will be robust. There'll be no limits on how many centrifuges are ready after a certain amount of years. They're going to be able to test, and even now, IR-8s, which are far more advanced centrifuges than they have today. So now, in addition, they are going to get, and this is not disputed, probably about after 6 months from today, somewhere between 6 months and 12 months, they'll have released from the banks about over $100 billion. Some people say it's $140 billion of money that has been frozen. This is money that they've gotten from oil sales and so on that has been frozen in accounts in various ways. That will be given to them. Now, you might remember the stimulus package that was in this country in 2008, which was, I think, $860 billion or something. And now I can't remember exactly what our economy, our GDP was then. Today it's roughly 17 trillion, but so it was a couple trillion less. Their GDP, this 150, let's say 100 billion stimulus package, their GDP is like 330 billion or something. So it's a tremendous jolt to their economy. For us to get a stimulus package like that, that's almost like $8 trillion going into our economy. You can't buy enough butter, with all that money. They're going to put it into a lot of guns. And they got a lot of, and by the way, they're on their backs. They've been on their back. They were on their backs before this deal, the interim deal was agreed in November 2013. And they're really, despite all the mischief they caused, or because of some of the mischief, they've actually had a lot of problems. They're losing in Syria. Assad is really, they put a lot into Syria, not so much soldiers, some, but the Hezbollah proxies are in there, and they're losing to the Islamic State, to other Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, which is an Al-Qaeda offshoot, other Sunni extremist groups. Hezbollah is losing, and they're the vanguard of the Hezbollah, of the Assad regime. They're the ones doing a lot of the fighting, by the way. It is not the Syrians, which are used more, the Syrian soldiers more to protect Assad and the regime. So the Iranians are really losing a lot, actually, but there's going to be a tremendous jolt to them, and they'll be able to fund a lot more. So if they're doing a lot of terrorism now, and by the way, this is why you would think they try to act like good boys, right? When they're negotiating with us, you'd think they'd be nice. Remember the Al-Quds day they have? They talk about death to Israel, death to America. That was just in the last week, so, and that's while they're signing the deal with us, that's what they're saying. So, there's going to be $100 to $150 billion in unfrozen assets, plus they're going to export a lot more oil. Now, how much is disputed, but that's not the point. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that in 6 months, at a minimum, they'll sell at least 400,000 barrels a day more than doing today. Even if oil's about $50 a barrel, do the math, you're going to get a lot more money from oil sales and normalizations. There's already, I just saw the German just led a delegation, the Vice Chancellor just led a delegation of German businessmen there. Frankly, how the Germans could be so economically invested in Iran for so many years is frankly shocking to me, given the German history. In addition, the inspection regime is not the regime, what we were told it was going to be. There's no anytime, anywhere. In fact, if some of you saw on Sunday, Secretary Kerry was on all the news shows, and on one of the news shows, I can't remember which one, he said we never really discussed anytime, anywhere, which means that the inspectors could go anywhere they want. There's going to be a process, a managed access, as they say. It could take at least 24 days. They want to go to a military site, and then it has to go through a whole process. But that's not any time, anywhere. And by the way, even any time, anywhere, which we had in Iraq in the 90s, was not really sufficient enough to cover everything. But there isn't any time, anywhere. And just, I think, today or yesterday, the Iranian defense minister said, yet again, we're not letting any inspectors on our military sites. Well, that's lovely, but they're not there. The inspectors aren't there to meet the troops. They're there to look at the weaponization that's going on that we believe is on the military sites. And there's this issue, well, what about if there's violations? So say they do cheat, which, you could argue whether they will or not, but what if they do? So the administration is talking about snapback, sanctions. First of all, any deal that's done before the violations are determined to be violations will be grandfathered in. Meaning, Germany could cut a deal tomorrow for selling, Siemens selling a lot of money for goods for their oil industry, and that will be grandfathered in, so that won't be sanctioned. So that's if there's real, true snapback sanctions. If that's even realistic, which it's not, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. This sanction regime that still exists today, or exists until the deal, was built with bipartisan efforts. It passed overwhelming members of Congress, both parties. This is not a partisan issue. None of this is. I'd say, there's probably no issue in Washington that has garnered more bipartisan support than Iran over the years. Look at the votes on Iran sanctions. It's something like, in the House, it's like 420 to 9. It's lopsided. You don't get votes like this on trade or on health care or on anything. This has been the most bipartisan issue this is. This is now, so this is where both sides have come together and put these really tough sanctions. And I don't think you're going to be able to put that together so quickly. And by the way, if there are snapback sanctions, the Iranians have a right, according to this deal, to get out of the deal. So if it's determined that they violated and they say, oh, we're going to put sanctions on you, they say, okay, fine, we're leaving. We're walking away with our marbles and we're going to run to nuclear weapons. It doesn't sound like, so what's the incentive? The incentive is never to really point out really any violations. So now, let's talk about the alternatives. The White House line here is the alternatives are worse. That is their mantra. Kerry has talked about it. President Obama talks about it. I believe the two words to focus on are alternatives and consequences. I think the consequences are more important than the alternatives. The White House would say the alternative is war, diplomatic isolation, and so on. President Obama just said the other day, and we all know there was just a UN vote yesterday, but that the other side will be, if Congress rejects this and the President Obama vetoes it, but there's a veto-proof majority that overrides the presidential veto. The president has said, well, the result will be that none of the other countries are going to fulfill, keep their sanctions on. The Iranians will rush to a bomb, and then other countries will rush to a bomb, and then you're going to have war. That is essentially the White House argument. The alternative is worse. And I testified at the House Foreign Affairs Committee about a week and a half ago, and there were some people, certainly more on the Democratic side, that raised this issue, including Elliot Engel, the ranking Democrat, who's actually who I think has a very good, a very strong, tough record on the Iranians, and he raised this issue. Well, what about the alternatives? Well, I think that before we get to the alternatives, let's think about the consequences of the deal. In the near term, consequences are a hell of a lot more mischief making in the region. If you like the Iranian policy, you're going to love when it's supercharged with all these billions of dollars that's going to go into Hezbollah and the Houthis. And by the way, the Iraqi government, which has certainly not been a friend to us, it's really much more controlled by the Iranians. And we'd bear some responsibility for that. So in the near term, they're going to have a supercharged capability in the region, there's no question, to influence other countries to control more capital. They already control about 4 Arab capitals in Beirut, in Damascus, in Baghdad, and now in Yemen. So that's the short term. The long term is you're going to have a nuclear Iran with international blessing. Now, the Iranians have never really been interested in just producing one bomb. They don't get a lot for that. But what they do get a lot is they have international legitimacy, they have a robust program, they have a lot of bombs. That's what they're thinking of. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, not really that long for them, I think. We think that way more. So, and then what's, I think, going to be the most immediate dangerous consequence? I don't even think it's the Iranian mischief making from all the money, although that's pretty significant. I think it's the nuclear contagion in the region. And actually, President Obama really kind of predicted this in 2012 when he was running for re-election. He said almost certainly other countries will get bombed, nuclear weapons, if the Iranians do. And the Saudis are the most obvious one because they got so much money and they have so much close relationship with the Pakistanis, and it's widely assumed that they're going to get bombed. So I think that the immediate, if the argument was let's freeze the Iranian nuclear program, and then in 15 years maybe they could have nuclear weapons, but we're going to contain them, we're going to confront them in Syria. We're going to actually freeze their program. They can't do any R&D. They get no money, no signing bonus. Then I think that the administration will have a much more legitimate argument and say, look, playing for time has value. In 15 years, if we keep squeezing them, maybe this regime falls. And that's really the ultimate solution is regime change. I think if that was the case, then I'd say the administration argument would be much stronger. But that's not the deal. It doesn't freeze the program. They're allowed to enrich low-enriched uranium. They're able to do a lot more R&D. They do get $150 billion in immediate influx of money, plus they get a lot more commercial relationships, plus there's international legitimacy for this, and you're going to get nuclear contagion because other countries in the region, the world isn't static, it's dynamic. Countries react to what's going on. And I think that what I fear is that, and I'll end on these points, 2 last points. This point is that I fear that the immediate interest, not just a boost of Iran's position, but but what the other countries are going to do. A year from now, this deal goes through, Congress doesn't override, the veto doesn't oppose it, then we're not going to just be talking about the Iranian issue. This deal regionalizes the problem. We're going to have to start looking see what are the Saudis doing? What are the Egyptians doing? What are the Turks? What are the Syrians? Well, Syria doesn't really exist. What are the Jordanians doing? Do we really want the Saudis to have a bomb? They might be our allies, but they're not our friends. Do we really want the Turks? I mean, Erdogan is as fanatic on the Sunni side as many of the Shia are on the other side. Do we want that? Jordan's our friend, but do we really want the Hashemites to get it? It's not the most stable country in the world, right? So I think this regionalizes the problem, and any good that's in this deal is is more than outweighed by the bad and the dangerous. And I do fear war as a consequence of the deal, not as an alternative. And if the alternative to this deal could be war, the administration might be right, because they've taken all the other levers off the table. If they had kept the military option on the table, if they would be supporting our friends and not our enemies, the Iranians, if we'd be confronting them in Syria and in Yemen, if we'd be trying to squeeze the Iranians, then I think we have a lot of levers. But the administration, for whatever reason, decided to remove all these levers and just say, well, we're just going to focus on diplomacy alone. And diplomacy is important, of course. We all want a diplomatic solution. But without levers, it's a lot of talking. And it doesn't get you as much as you would like. And I would just finalize, so Shelley mentioned I wrote a book on Churchill. It was based on my doctoral dissertation. What we all, in this country, we generally revere Churchill. Why? Well, there's a lot of actually. My book was on Zionism, but what is he most known for, of course? Why? Because he opposed the Nazis in the 30s. He also opposed the Munich deal, which was Chamberlain. What people forget is that Chamberlain was the head of the Conservative Party. He was a member of the Conservative Party, Churchill. He opposed his own party head, who was also the Prime Minister at the time. I think it's not just that Churchill, we all look at as like the model of the great leader, the guy who like goes against the wind. What we forget is he wasn't just unpopular in the country, he was unpopular in his own party. They actually never liked him even after he became a great hero after World War II. They never forgave him. But in '38, when he was constantly in the 30s opposing the government's approach to Hitler, he was going against his own party. And what I'm trying to say is we have to think the same way. This is not a party issue. This is not a partisan issue. This issue transcends party and administration. I don't care if President Obama's a Republican or whatever. It's the substance that matters. It's not the party. And foreign policy historically, until unfortunately the last couple decades, has been more of a bipartisan issue. That was always more the history, unlike domestic policy, which was always known, which was natural that it would be partisan. But foreign policy used to be more transcendent. And I think this issue, which is the most important issue, has to transcend party. And I believe this deal overall, even though it has some pluses, the negatives are so outweigh the positives that I believe is really a historic and dangerous mistake. So that's how I'll conclude.